This is exciting. Jesse, how are you?
Hey, how's it going?
Hi.
Hi, Lucas. I don't believe I've met you before.
No, nice to meet you.
Hey, awesome. So, Allison, what we're going to have you do is, do you see if you put your cursor down at the bottom of your screen, it's got a green share button?
Yes.
Okay, if you click that, that's going to share your screen with everybody. And what that's going to allow you to do is just play your presentation for us. Okay, but it'll keep our videos, it'll keep them like right here.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah, I'm going to see if I can find my presentation.
Okay. Alan.
So it can be on my computer.
Hey, Alan, how's it going?
Good, good.
5 a.m., huh?
Saturday morning, 5 a.m.
Oh no. I heard everybody said it was too late last time, so I went earlier.
No, it's all right. It's good. It's good. Look forward to it.
Just got to find my presentation.
Alan, my bees survived the winter.
Really?
Yeah, I opened them up yesterday. We had, because we had negative 35 Fahrenheit for a while. I was curious, but I buttoned them up pretty good this year. When I opened them up, they still had a few 20,000 in there, so.
Wow,
it was a good surprise.
So they kind of just hibernate, or are they still buzzing around getting food?
No, what they do is they have a 28-day life cycle, and that slows down when they're in the winter. So they can live about 3 months during the winter. And what they do is they put the queen in the middle,
right?
All crowd around her and feed her, and you have an attrition rate. So the outside of the ball will start to die.
Okay, yeah.
And then hopefully by the time they can start feeding again in the spring, enough of them haven't died. And
right.
you have a core ball that survives. So that's what you really worry about. My ball was about the size of a basketball, and if you can keep it to the size of a baseball, you're good. So they did well.
Okay, so that sounds like quite a high attrition rate too, doesn't it?
Oh yeah, I mean it's close to 90%. They're miraculous because she can lay eggs, very quickly. She lays them maybe 2,000 a day, so they can replace themselves very, very quickly.
I just couldn't find the PowerPoint there, Jess. Is it
okay? So I'm going to send it back to you really quick.
Oh, great! Thanks.
Start it right out of your email, okay?
A couple of versions going.
Yeah. Yep, it's on its way.
Lovely.
So, Alan, I don't think Mike is going to be here because he's at a bachelor party for his stepson. And I think Tim will be here, but he's at a conference in Calgary, so he said he'd be here for the first half hour, maybe.
Right. Okay. I last weekend went up north, and after, because Jesse had sent me some photos, Alison, and of all the snow, so I'd sent him a picture back of sun, and because we went up north, my wife had said, "Oh, take some more pictures for Jesse." So I've got pictures of blue sky and clouds and bush and what have you.
Yeah. Now, Allison, we've had quite a bit of snow in the past few weeks. So the school I was at recording, they had a few doorways that were actually closed. They couldn't go out them because we had about 6-foot snow drifts that were blocking the entire doorway. And I sent one of those pictures to Alan.
Yeah, amazing.
Just tell him what it's like up here.
I didn't manage to open that message, so we might just do the paper.
Okay, that's fine.
Yeah, which is actually fine because it's the paper, it's the sort of content I'm interested in regardless. Yeah. Awesome. Okay, so I'll just open that. Which paper? This one. Does everybody see this paper?
Yeah, I've got it.
Yep.
Okay, we'll go off this.
Okay. So we do have a new person here, a new member, Lucas.
Yes, hi.
If you want to introduce yourself, that'd be great.
Sure. Well, I'm a PE teacher. I work at an international school in Gothenburg in Sweden. And I had an opportunity a couple of years ago, actually 4 years ago, to do half-time research and half-time working. So that's what I'm doing. And it was grading time, and I came across, well, I've seen it before, but I didn't think about it as much. We got a new curriculum in 2011, and there were some new terms in there, and one of them was complexity. So I started to think about, what did I mean by this, and how are we supposed to interpret it? And that's my application for the research school was to find that out. And I wrote an article, which was published together with my mentors, and now I'm working on the second one, which is a comparison to the first one. Pretty much, first how you can interpret it from a discourse perspective, and then the second one, what does the teacher think about complexity, and then I'm going to tie it all together in. I don't know if you're familiar with the term licentiate. It's like a half PhD. So, yeah, that's where I am right now.
Awesome. Cool. Well, thank you.
Obviously need a presentation on that.
Yeah. Absolutely. So, Allison, whenever you want to go, we're good to go.
Okay. Well, thanks very much for getting up our super early, stupid o'clock. And just thank you in advance for any feed forwards as my initial ideas are getting started. So I've got paper here, and then Jess can send out the PowerPoint. The paper is really to give a bit of an overview of some of my research to date. And so as the backdrop, I was a physical educator in the US, predominantly Texas, a bit in New Mexico, and the issues regarding physical education and the propensity for children to be unhealthy and have obesity, they were perhaps quite exaggerated in Texas with quite some high prevalence. We also had daily physical education, so we had a lot of different things going on, and I was trying to do something I felt was useful for children and for teachers in and around the district. And so I got a lot of sponsorship, a lot of support to say, well, what could you do? So I started to read into Catherine Ennis and look at critical thinking, and then I started to look over Scandinavian research and look at different phases of thinking, metacognition, and found some research where they had maybe 6 phases. And then I looked at some research also in England, it was, in science, and I was getting a better working understanding of metacognition, as it were, really. And then what I wanted to do was try and find practicable theories that would help me as a field teacher, as a physical education field-based researcher, really, because I've always done research as I taught and vice versa. And so came up with a paper, sort of a pencil and paper method of trying to develop autonomy in children, autonomy of thought as it sort of pertained to skills, motor skills and motor competency. So I've got sort of designed a kind of cute and cheesy, it looks like it's a Toblerone except you can't eat it. That's like a candy. So, and it's just got 3 phases. And it was just looking at your basic principles of metacognition, which were very didactic, admittedly, very linear, but they started with procedural knowledge, declarative, what's going on, procedural, how are we doing it, and conditional transfer. And as I started to do a bit more reading in instructional models, and even some of the teaching styles, I saw that, well, this is pedagogy. I mean, as teachers in physical education, certainly where I was teaching, we'd start and we'd identify what it was we were learning and with the children, and then we'd model and describe and break it down, and then we'd use it in different ways which were more complex as determined by the children and what they wanted to do with it. So for my way of thinking, that kind of made sense, and I thought, oh great, I'm going to capture that in a way and see if children are more aware of how they're learning fundamental movement skills. Will their motor competency get better? Yes, but will it get better to the extent that they can impact their physical fitness and their wellness? And looking at World Health Organization guidelines for physical activity and fitness and everything we know, children just weren't getting fitter. And I was just interested in the fact of the relationships between maybe competency and fundamental movements and fitness or other aspects. But this paper really looked at sort of fitness based. And so I started in South Texas and worked across the district and basically took 1,000 children, just partitioned them. It was a sample, it was a nice sample. It was basically 250 children across each group. And I looked at different ways of embedding a developmentally appropriate resistance program for children. So just looked at children and said, here's a way to get fit by using your bodies and using your body weight. And children, a year later, they did get fitter. So it was quite nice to say, well, that's good. So if I'll sort of slide down the paper, and the abstract sort of just captures what happened. And so essentially everybody got fitter, which was great, except the control, even better. So from a linear perspective, I had said children who are in one of 3 sort of conditions, which had various different pedagogies and very different attributions of resistance and using their body weight, they're going to get fitter. So they all got fitter, and those who were in the true control did not get fitter. So I thought, well, great, that's nice. I didn't really learn much as a physical educator, and I probably learned even less as a physical educator, teacher educator. But then I thought, well, okay, so what about their learning? And despite showing competency that had improved in formative assessment, so for them to go from using their body weight to using resistance bands to then using suspension systems, for them to progress through a system, they were allowed to go at their own pace. However, even though they'd showed more competency to progress, because all 800, 750 children got to use suspensions because they were ready, but no one exhibited higher metacognition. They actually had less awareness of what they were doing than before they had started, and worse still, their motivation was significantly lower. So it was great. Well, they got fitter, and the district did say, well, we are worried about children's fitness. So in one sense, we were successful. In the other sense, it was just tragic that all these children had been turned off despite using developmentally appropriate resistance training, which was embedded in the curriculum in ways that we thought that they could handle or enjoy. So I just scratched my head and thought, okay, well, let's look at that and what can I learn from that to carry on and try and further my understanding with a different set of constraints. So coming over from South Texas over to South London, the constraints were very different, and as different as they were, they presented challenges which I don't think I could have understood. I didn't understand, but I was quite happy to go about. So I was approached with a request to do some research with people, with a group who basically were looking to see if children could get fitter, and we ran a pilot. I ran a pilot and said, well, they're not going to get fitter the way you're expecting them to get fitter, but maybe we can develop their appreciation of fitness and healthy well-being, maybe for the more sort of holistic opportunities around future-based national curriculum outcomes, because we don't have many national curriculum outcomes, but they're basically sort of present. There's only one that's future-based about developing a healthy lifestyle, and that's sort of adjacent to the Americans. So we're agreed in both countries that we do want children to be future-looking and develop that appreciation, and that's supported by high-quality physical education. Also, the high-quality physical education here says that PE, physical education, can operate within the class setting, but of course in and around the school community. So from a Bronfenbrenner perspective, I could actually use the centrality of the classroom to focus the learning, but then open the learning to manifest different ways of learning and appreciation by the children. So the American, they had 5 days a week of physical education, and one was fitness with resistance and one was fitness in games. And in England, they had 2 days of physical education, and with 15 to 20 minutes of physical activity appreciation at any point across the lesson. And then what we didn't do in the first one was we didn't encourage children to go beyond physical education, and we just felt that they had so much physical education and after school clubs that we wouldn't worry in Texas. But in England, we thought, well, the classes are limited. Can we actually do a little bit more of facilitating and mentoring so that they can take a bit of leadership? So it sort of spilled into the teachers, did the explicit teaching, but used a lot of inquiry based in the second approach. But then they had peer leaders. They taught the peer leaders. They taught all children basically how to teach things in the playground at lunchtime. And then after that, there were no teachers, there were no grown-ups, there were no adults. It was just the children to see if they were going to use the fundamental skills and the games and activities that had been sort of visited and introduced during physical education time. So from looking at the children in Texas where they were fitter and less motivated and less aware of the purpose of what they were doing, the second group then took ownership. I felt they took ownership, and the teachers did a good job, yes, but then the teachers, after physical education, the teachers had no input. The children started to increase their physical activity participation in the playground, which was measured. The first study was across a year, the second was a half a year. So there were lots of comparisons and lots of differences. And when I came out of the second one, and I didn't quite get all the data together last year for Mike and Nicola, but I was on track. And so when I went to ASEP and I went to the complexity meeting, and you know, my head started to buzz, and I kind of wanted to say, hooray, hooray, I finally know that I don't know what I wanted to know. But I also realized it was important that the children, they didn't get fitter in the second one. So they didn't get fitter, but we decided not to measure that because it wasn't deemed as relevant. It just wasn't, it wasn't as important as I'd first anticipated. And I felt it would be, but their motivation significantly increased, and their metacognition also did. And there's a lot of research, as we all know, linking motivation with autonomy and structured autonomy and interest in children. So that was helpful. So if I think I stuck it in, I've got a table. I think it's page 13. That's my favorite number. Oh yeah. So there's a page 13 or page 14. So there's just a bit of my paper where, and I'll send out the PowerPoint, where I've started to think, okay, from a linear perspective, I'm very clear. I might not write it very well, but I'm very clear on what was done in Texas and London and what happened. So pedagogy should be revisited so that children gain more autonomy, so that they have a bit more, they're empowered regardless of what's going on in the classroom. I think everything that everybody would recognize, and there were attempts to use inquiry-based teaching and to to develop autonomy and agency in the first study. So there were explicit pedagogical approaches that for some reason did not work, yet in the second one it went. And so I went back to everyone's papers, which I haven't been able to. I've gone back to everybody's papers, but I haven't consolidated them or conflated them in a way that's working. So then I went further back to the complexity sort of attributes that Alan, you've edited, you've got in your book from Davis and Samara on page 4 and 5. And I started to use them as a comparative lens for me to say what was evident and emergent in Texas or wasn't, and what was not. So in looking at both of them, I went through the qualities. There were 8 qualities that I had seen which show that a system is complex. So from starting a study which was situated through metacognition and motivation, I just found that I managed to draw only linear information and knowledge, which is both less meaningful and less helpful for pre-service and in-service physical education teachers. And as I'm looking at these properties, I just felt it's going to give me more opportunity to open up my awareness of the possibilities of what happened and what didn't happen and what could have happened. And so I've done it's very didactic, but at this stage I've looked at them and I've gone through each one, so the self-organized and the bottom up and the short range and the nested structure. And what I suppose what I had some sort of simple supposition thinking, well, it's all going to be one way for England, and it's going to all be one way for Texas. And at some level, there are a lot of attributes which do sort of cluster around the English characteristics, whereby there was more autonomy, there was with the children being able to create things and for the learning and the experiences to develop in unpredicted fashions. So I can see how that's emerged in the London-based study. But what this, I've used it as an analytical framework. What I didn't expect, which was probably why I got stuck in the paper, was there are differences now between the secondary teachers and the primary teachers in Texas that I had never endeavored to contemplate or to report. But using the complexity, I found that now they're glaringly obvious. It sort of behooves me to sort of state that this was the case. So I find that regardless of the differences, and I do have a chart which says this was it's 5 days of PE versus 2 and all the other differences. But regardless of those, the findings and the characteristics between the elementary and the primary teachers for London and Texas are closer than those with regard to in relation to the secondary teachers and the elementary in America. So the primary teachers, their propensities and qualities are closer to those of the American elementary than the elementary and the middle school. And so this is where I've sort of had a head jerk, because all the teachers in Texas are trained as physical educators. You get your license, and you can go. You can take your lessons for all levels, but you're an educator, but as we all know, and also in different countries it's different. But physical educators are, for the most part, certainly in the state of Texas, they are coaches, and some of them identify and they self-identify as coaches before they identify as teachers. And when society views teachers, they will actually use the word coach. So there's the propensity of coaches. The question then becomes, are they coaching when they're teaching? And regardless of the pedagogical training, it was a term for training for the London study, but it was a whole year of preparation for the American study. So regardless of the pedagogies that should have been compared and should have looked different across the findings, the sort of the teacher-centered perspective seemed to be imbued through the coaching styles, and the styles, regardless, even if I said inquiry and they were trained inquiry, the secondary teachers at the middle school level, Key Stage 3, they reverted, they used basically styles A through E, mostly A through D, but definitely they never crossed the inquiry side, whereas the elementary teachers and the primary teachers in England, they took a lot more ownership, and they seemed to be, they had greater degrees of freedom to let things happen and be more comfortable with the unpredictability. Also, I found the ones who, after doing research and going back, found the ones who were teaching middle school, Key Stage 3, they were all very good, highly functional and effective coaches, but they tended to adopt that shroud of bureaucracy where it was just bottom down. So again, I found that the ability or the propensity to want to be more creative and take ownership in the primary and the elementary was higher. So now I quite like the confusion, but there's quite a bit of dissonance, because now I'm thinking, despite the elementary school teachers, despite the elementary physical educators in Texas being probably in a more sort of top-down system, they still enabled children to have a bit more ownership, and they did try to be creative in what they were doing. But and when the study ceased in the post, which I haven't reported, but it feeds into this, the elementary teachers kept things going and sort of took ownership of ideas, whereas at the Key Stage 3, they seemed to just be very polite and compliant, but the study was over and that was it. So I feel like I was useless. I feel like I did, the children got fitter, but I feel like the teachers at the Key Stage 3 didn't get the opportunity to value it, and I maybe didn't pitch it in a way that was of value to them. Whereas the Key Stage 1 and 2, the elementary teachers in South Texas across those schools, they kept it going, but they did take it more, they sort of took it down a notch, so it was less systematic. And then in England, the children kind of ran away from it. So basically, as soon as the physical educator, as myself as a physical educator, as soon as we went in and trained the classroom teachers on the content, the classroom teachers then went in their physical education lessons. They spent 10 minutes for a couple of weeks, and the children just ran with it. And then that was it. The children sort of took command, they took control, but when they took control, they just let things happen, and things that were unexpected and unpredicted. And the games that they came up with in the playground at lunchtime were far more interesting than I'd seen or could have come up with. And so now I'm scratching my head, and I'm grateful for using complexity, because I'd like to try and capture some of the nuances in a way that's meaningful for physical education teachers and physical education pre-service educators. And I think that's where I could leave it there, because obviously I've done study. It did take a lot of work with the study in the build-up and the preparation, so it had to be quite closed-ended in one perspective. But I think looking at it through a complexity lens, I'm going to be able to revisit the knowledge base through metacognition, through the fitness base, and the motivation to say, well, the World Health Organization has noted that despite our National Association of Moderate to Vigorous Physical Activity, it's not being met. The World Health Organization guidelines are problematic. And if we know the physical health issues of even government papers, the mental health, they're all using the word complex. If they are complex, then why are we just thinking some linear approaches are going to be effective? And when I'm looking at the limited physical education that we have, it would be nice to have a bit more serious dialogue, looking at the emergence of some predicted and unpredicted aspects of children's health, so that I think I'd hopefully have a program that could be more effective and meaningful for children in physical education at this stage. And that's where I am. So I feel like I need a lot of help, but I also feel brave enough to have started to start to read with a bit more purpose, which is why I'm really grateful for people's input today.
Okay, so I think we can start just going around and asking Allison some questions, maybe commenting,
Yes,
maybe
please.
asking about her work, those type of things.
Yes, please.
And anything, Allison, that we talk about, just take it in a constructive way. You know, we're reviewers at heart, so we don't.
Oh, no, that's okay. I have such a long way to go. I'm just really delighted to be able to start to think about it beyond a linear fashion. I've got so long to go, but now I'm getting slightly more aware of what it is I need to learn, rather than just think, oh, I've got a lot to learn.
Excellent, excellent. Okay, does anybody want to start us off?
Everyone's always shy to start, aren't they? I'll just say a few things and then I'll let somebody else say some stuff too. I just want to say, wow, it's an amazing study, Alison. I really appreciate the huge amount of work that's gone into this, and the sheer number of students and teachers that you've been working with. Yeah, it's wonderful. So I've got a couple of ideas, but I just want to hear some other people talk first rather than...
It's like America's Got Talent. Nobody knows who to shoot down where. That's okay.
Oh, no, it's not a matter.
Are you waiting for me to say something intelligent here now?
Lucas, do it.
Yes.
I'm a novice in this area, so I don't think I can contribute very much. I can just maybe ask questions. I was thinking I could be a fly on the wall today, but apparently not. So how will you use the complexity in, I think you mentioned it, but in more detail, in this model? Can you maybe develop that a little bit?
I mentioned in my paper that sort of in progress. I've mentioned complexity principles, and I wasn't comfortable zoning into a definition of complexity thinking. And I see in other works of my esteemed colleagues that it's used conceptually, but I also know as myself as a physical educator or researcher, I tend to use things very pragmatically and field-based. So I'm trying to do what makes me feel, which helps me to understand it better. So I've practiced using it this year implicitly, and practiced the principles in my sort of implicit planning, and also started to ask people, is it okay to use it explicitly? So I've started to sort of drop it in classes, drop it in lectures, and no one's run out the room, but there has been sort of that sort of cowboy silence where you just hear everything and a feather drop. So I've started to be aware that it's conceptual, but it's good for me to deliberate. So in one sense, I'm comfortable just to use it to expand my aspirations of what could have happened. And in fact, what's the least interesting is what happened. It's what I haven't reported and haven't captured. And just because there are a couple of thousand children doesn't mean there are other aspects that were far more powerful for me to learn about, rather than just a statistical procedure, which was also good practice for me. So as I've started my funky, it's very clumsy, my funky diagram, which basically just takes those 8 characteristics. What I'm trying to do is try to enact them both conceptually and pragmatically. as a working tool, and that's what I've done with my metacognition, and that's what I feel like I do with motivation. I've got to be able to feel it and work with it like I do in physical education, or it's of less use to me. Now, maybe once I've developed more of an understanding by having done that, and that knowledge becomes more tacit, I'll then be able to sort of just reduce it to the way I explore options and ideas. But right now, I'll be looking at the basic the findings of in and around motivation, of around all the fitness competencies as drawn from the Fitnessgram, and the knowledge base as drawn from, in America they had final assessment because it's assessed over there, and also drawn from their meta awareness of what they were learning. And I'm going to use, I think my idea is to look at the principles, and not so much as a shopping list. I've started as a shopping list right now, but look at the principles of complexity and think what happened here and what could have happened, and how is this going to impact my pre-service teachers as they go into schools, because the affordances in English primary schools are far less than those in the ones that we had in South Texas. It was just the way physical education is respected, construed. So it's what can my students do with their knowledge so that children can get a love of wanting to improve their physical wellness, but use affordances that are far less, with less equipment, with less money. And that's why I based the program. The program I designed was on, it's called Resistance 3. It starts from their body. So if you've got no money from your department, children work with stability, gaining stability and losing and gaining balance. And then if they do that, then there is an elastic. In America, I had a lot more suspension trainers because the schools let me put up all the hooks. So basically all our primary schools, we kitted up with suspensions. But in England, we just have to sort of throw it around a hoop somewhere. So there are limitations. And so for me, a lot of my pre-service physical educators are really interested in getting children having self-respect, a robust identity about who they are when they move and when they're still, and developing that appreciation. So it sort of behooves me to say, well, we're going to look at different issues. And one issue that I'm passionate about is that children feel healthy, and they do become healthy. And there'll be a bit of didactic aspect to that because there's subject knowledge that they have to learn. But can they do it in a far more interesting way than I'd done previously, so that children aren't turned off the subjects or just do things after school because they feel better about themselves as a result of a positive and productive physical education experience. So I'm using them to better understand as entities, discrete entities, but in order to become autonomous, one needs to be motivated and interested. In order to become fit, one needs to be interested. So they're all very interrelated, and there'll be some sort of unpredictable aspects that I'd like to explore. And this is where I'm thinking of how complexity might implicitly guide me.
So Allison, I have a real quick question. I just came off of a 3-week data collection. And so it's fresh in my mind. So you were collecting data and you have experience in both the States and in Great Britain. So obviously the teachers, when you go in and collect these data, have questions about, well, what your research is, well, what are you actually looking for? And you probably tried to explain that to them. What was your response from them as far as complexity theory and some of those underpinnings?
Well, always as a university teacher, in America, I always had one full day when I was always teaching. So the district would always know me as a physical educator, and I guess they just got used to be how I was and how I operated. There weren't as many questions at that stage for Texas. I didn't mention complexity. In London, haven't mentioned. what they were aware of, and that's because I worked with all the teachers in Texas. I spent a year working with them, with my assistants, my graduate assistants as well, gearing them up and getting them comfortable. So they had workbooks and a little bit of CPD on motivating children, on developing critical thinking, looking at instructional models, looking at teaching styles, and seeing which way, how could I take my resistance training program, and would they prefer it to be imbued through teaching style approach or instructional? And they seem to be a bit more comfortable with an instructional approach. So that was that. They didn't have any questions. The typical question for metacognition is, well, is that a fancy word for, and they already know what it is. So I feel bad for using it. It's just that if I have an instrument that says metacognition, I kind of want them to have seen the word first. So the complexity, nobody, it's only now I'm blowing my own socks off. But maybe it's better that I hadn't mentioned it then, because I would have known even less. It's only because of Mike and Nicola and just I'm being brave enough to walk into places where I've got no business being, to try and learn, that I feel ready to start to unpack this. But there's I don't want to get overwhelmed, because I'm very comfortable in what I do know, but I'm also ready to extend that, because it's just so linear that it's lost its meaning. And that takes me back to when I was a physical education teacher, and I just said, this isn't good enough. And I went to do my PhD because I thought I can do more, and I need to do more. And I'm at that stage again. It's like, this is not good enough. I just have to be more effective. And I'm hoping that the complexity gives me a lot of opportunity to share with my student teachers, who are amazing and super interested. And I think I could be more effective.
I wish Tim would have been here, because in his teacher education program, he'll head on key concepts of complexity theory. He'll actually outline constraints, self-organization, emergence, and he does it in such a way that it actually comes across fairly good to his students.
I can do that easily through motor development, because I'm really averse. So if I teach anything through movement competency, I just sound like I know what I'm talking about. It's when it goes into a bit sort of nebulous or a little bit more abstract that it's good for me to engage my brain. Yeah. But our students are comfortable with constraints theory, the Bronfenbrenner ecological notions, unpredictability. They've got those bits, but I'm as an educator right now, yeah. I need to be. I've just started with the year 3s, and we need to start it earlier, and I need to get better at doing that.
Yeah. Maybe this is a European and US difference, but I get a lot of pushback on nonlinearity. For some reason, within our system of education, it's taught, linear science throughout their entire educational background, that cause and effect, which cause and effect, obviously that's a big thing, but essentially they can't even break outside of the notion that things may self-organize and there may be emergent products. Do you experience any of that? Have you experienced any of that pushback on nonlinearity?
With regard to the teachers in my research, or my pre-service teachers?
How about both?
Well, for all studies, I always put them out there, and it's schools volunteer. Now, then but the question then is, who, if it's a bottom-up emergent, when they volunteer, everyone's volunteering. If it's a top-down, if they're volunteering, it's the head teacher or the principal. And that changes things, because that changes the resistance, and it changes the time. And the ones that are kind of top down, where there was a head teacher or principal who really wanted this idea, it's quite difficult, because I've got to spend or even waste more energy, because they kind of want to do it, but they don't really want to do it. But whereas when it's with a sort of holistic embracing by the school that, we'd like to explore this, it's easier, because people are far more open and forgiving and gracious, regardless of the word volunteering in the samples, because everyone volunteered. But I had schools where they were volunteering, and I'm walking away thinking, I know they're not enjoying this, but will I give them, no, we won't, we'd like to finish this. I said, well, when you know you'd like to finish something, you're kind of done with it.
Yeah. Awesome. Okay. Anybody else want to chime in? Questions? Comments?
You want me to say something?
Yeah, Mike.
Hi, Alison.
Hi, Mike. How are you?
I'm good. I'm good. I'll make 3 observations, and which may involve discussion or not. The first one, what I'm really intrigued by, really interested in, is taking a study that was not in any way really informed by ideas from complexity and then revisiting it. And I actually think that would be an interesting long-term agenda for every study that's out there. The question, of course, as you say, a complexity lens, and I think the great difficulty that we're all having is that if there is going to be a significant shift to complexity, it is a paradigm shift. It's not a theoretical shift. And that paradigm shift, therefore, is about how people view the world. And I think the difficulty that comes with that is that, and certainly in presentations over the years, I've had people saying, yeah, I use complexity for this, or I use it for that. And in a sense, suggest that it's a bit of a theoretical lens for a small bit when it's the time to do it or not. So I think to make that shift is whatever it is that makes it work for you. And clearly it would be interesting almost over the next few years to unpack your story as to how you start to see this new lens that you've got. Mm-hmm. Because within the group of people that you've got in front of you at the moment, you know, there's words that Jesse, from a more scientific perspective than there's words that and that he uses that I don't really use, but I think we sort of agree the same thing. And I think so. We're still, I think, at the early days of making sense of this complexity stuff, which is partly why I think the bandwagon is quite slow to roll. And I think that's just a point. So I applaud you for trying it, because clearly something that some people have said at some point in this have tweaked you and made you realize that maybe you have to start to do it. And I actually think that the shift to complexity is probably, to begin with, 95% emotional and 5% cognitive, because it is, I think, an emotional shift. Just as Jesse said, that to move away from linearity, if that's been your driver, I think is problematic. So that's my first point, and we could maybe spend the next 25 years discussing that. The second point about your study, is probably 2 things, and my main thing is that I suppose what started my journey into complexity was this idea of self-organization. Now, it's not the only part of it, and I'm not for a minute going to suggest that. But what strikes me, that what you're talking about is that from a pedagogical perspective, what is it that we need to be able to do to help these young people become good self-organizers? They do self-organize de facto. As a complexivist, that's what I believe. Yes, and I'll come on to other bits in a minute, but by the teachers delivering stuff that is only about one domain of behavior, i.e. the physical domain, yes, you're right, you probably will improve fitness. And if that's your only goal or your only aim, that probably will work if you do that twice or 3 times or 4 times a week for a year. That's a bit of a no-brainer. However, if you want those young people to self-organize in such a way that not only do they become fitter, but they engage regularly through choice in a democracy, in physical activity to become fit, that then behoves us to engage with a wider range, of domains of behavior, i.e. much more holistic. And interestingly, I get the feeling that in Texas, the teachers knew more about physical fitness and bored the kids rigid.
Yep.
In London, they didn't.
Yep.
And they didn't make much progress physically, but because they were much more holistic, the kids were brought on board. So that idea of supporting these kids to self-organize, I think, is an interesting one around there. I think the other bit I want to say is that the kids are self-organizing within constraints. Those constraints in Texas are different than they are in London, but actually within each of those areas within Texas, the constraints are different, and they might be to do with the school, the community, the teachers, the rules, blah, 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 blah. So by understanding the constraints and the affordances, how do we then help and support the young people to be dead good self-organizers over a long period of time is for me a complexity question.
Okay.
And that then makes me, as a teacher or a teacher educator, think differently than I did 20 years ago.
Yeah, before you move on, Mike, to your third one.
Well, that was I actually merged. I merged the second and third point.
Well, thank you very, very much. Can I challenge you to maybe give me your opinion on what you thought about the ambiguously bounded aspects of?
Well, I think the point for me about constraints and affordances are, so everybody, in my view, self-organizes within boundaries. But each person who's on the screen at the moment is self-organizing in their own way, and therefore that is why the boundaries are ambiguous. Alan is bringing a different knowledge base than I am, than Lucas is, than Jesse are, and you are. So the boundaries are pretty much, you could argue that the boundaries at the moment are pretty much the same, but they're ambiguous because we individually are responding to those boundaries, are reacting in whatever way, and therefore they're not set in stone.
Yes, and what I thought was fascinating was that for some particular reason, not regardless of the teachers, the children in South Texas didn't have that will, desire, or ability to do that. But to do what? To sort of move beyond the boundaries that were given. The boundaries that were given, the parameters of the study, everybody stayed within the study. No one ventured to go beyond the 3 levels. No one ventured to take a risk or a dare with any of the moves and put them into sort of rhythm or tempo or jazz it up. And in Britain, the children took what they got and they kind of stole it like pirates. And then 2 weeks later, we didn't recognize what they were doing because it was just so different, because they'd taken so much ownership of it. And they were all fundamentals.
So I think central to that is that whatever the boundaries were, all the people, and this would be my take, are still self-organizing in their own way to those. Be that the principals of the schools or the head teachers, be that the teachers, and be that the children. Mm-hmm. So they're still, I would argue that in 1822 in Ayrshire, in Scotland, people were still self-organizing. They might have been doing the same thing for decades and decades, but they were still self-organizing. So the examples you've got there, everybody is still self-organizing in relation to the boundaries that they are within. And clearly, if the teachers that you're talking about in Texas are taking this at very much face value and are more or less just repeating it, and therefore the kids, so the nature of the experience for the kids, boundaries that are being set for them are likely to be a bit different than these more holistic boundaries that will have been set by the teachers in London. So all of a sudden, what appeared to be a similar experience, by the time that that was passed on, Chinese whispers, it became something different.
Yes, exactly.
So that's, again, and that's complexity happening with the teachers and the kids. So the lens is not just for the kids. That lens is informing the whole process.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
Wow, this is awesome. Thank you. Thank you.
And the way I look at when we talk about people self-organizing, we've been doing this for a very long time. And essentially, we've been learning through self-organizing since we left the jungle 2 million years ago. And a teacher doesn't cause learning any more than anything else causes learning. But what I conceptualize it as, the teacher provides certain feedback that allows shortcuts in that self-organizing process. And really, that's what my research, that's looking at, well, what type of shortcuts are we producing, and can we get them there a little bit faster? And I think it's interesting, I think within the states, our assessment system actually puts a lot of pressure. I think that's a unique constraint that probably put some of those, that caused some of those results that you saw, where they didn't go outside of that, because really the teachers are pushing them towards making that accountability at the end of the lesson. So that's just an interesting thing that I got out of it.
Thank you. And I did get permission from the state to write the exam so that it aligned with, because in America, you can go with you can either stick with the national standards or stick with your respective state standards. And most part, they're very similar, aren't they, Jesse? With one another. So, and Texas, they just did theirs, which kind of emulate the national. So
yeah, usually they're based directly off of NASB. I mean, NASB informs all of those. So
yes,
yeah.
And but the only one that was common to both of the one was the physical lifestyle. The future-based sort of opportunity, which feeds into what Mike was saying, and hopefully there's a pedagogy, as you refer to, with those shortcuts that can make things that traditionally turn off a lot of children to turn them on. So it is more important that they get the appreciation and the fundamental skill themes, and all of those approaches do work well with the constraints that we have in England with the limited teacher time. So it's more important that the children do get that time to feel good about themselves trying things, so that they're more likely to try it out of class. But if I was back in South Texas, and they still had the same issues regarding health, it would be nice to say, well, we can still give ownership. Like we give a bit in New Mexico, they had less physical education, for example, but they had more ownership in what they were doing. And it's just interesting if I think there's some tensions between a sports culture and the expectation of the function of physical education. And I think that also invites consideration, because that's quite a complex issue in itself. We could always write and read to death what PE should be for, but in Texas, sometimes it's wrapped up, and if by the time you get to Key Stage 3, middle and high school, you're in PE because you weren't good enough to be in anything else. Whereas in Britain, we like to think you're in physical education so that you can develop warrior appreciation, so that you can share with your family or your friends at the weekend and try things. And so I was looking at the constraints, and I thought the constraints I found some were debilitators and some were facilitators. So I had this a very linear notion of what was working for one and not working for the other. And I've tried to flip them to sort of empower myself as an educator to say, well, this is how it was. How could I open this up to greater possibility for all the stakeholders? And so it gets back to that community holistic approach. As Mike was saying, just the domains of learning, the holistic approach, yes, but also more of a community-based. And maybe that complexity could also be addressed as physical education is embedded in communities rather than just felt and perceived as a part of a national curriculum. I can't speak much of the Scottish one. I read it, and every year I visit my sister, and she let me teach physical education for her class up in Edinburgh. So I've always sort of enjoyed that, visiting the wee ones. But looking at our national curriculum in England, it's very linear. You could have guessed who wrote it, and you could have guessed their background, and I think even in English policy at this stage, if we don't need to rewrite the curriculum. It's lovely in one sense because it's so open. You could hijack it.
Yeah, but Alison, there's a really important point about Scotland, England, New Zealand, wherever else, is that all of these curricula, and you talked there first about how you would look at this in a sense beyond the school.
Yes.
And we are still constrained by 18th century or 19th century buildings and structures that constrain all the stuff we're talking about here. It's not that the kids are not self-organizing, but the boundaries, the constraints, however you want to use that language, have actually not changed with that way of thinking. Mm-hmm. So it is extremely, going back to Jessie's point about the nature of the assessment, our assessments are in many parts very, very, very tight. And therefore that closes, it doesn't mean the kids don't self-organize, but it closes the parameters within which they are able to self-organize. And if you actually take the idea of, you said there, what does this look like if our physical education de facto is about the life of the children, not just in the context of the formal schooling, but actually extracurricularly and beyond the school, that starts to, it gets us to ask an awful lot of other questions, one of which will be, what will schools look like in 200 years? And the answer is, I bloody hope they're not like they are now, because the stuff that we're talking about will still be constrained really, really, really tightly in many different ways. And that's why, to some extent, as a complexivist, you've got to try and find a way to rant on about these things and articulate that in a way that is, and that's how we'll start to see the change happening.
Thank you.
Right, Dr. Ovens, come on.
Well, the unfortunate thing about going later on in the discussion is that other people have pretty much said what you want to say, and said it much better than I can. So all I can do is sort of reinforce, and I really like, Alison, what Mike said. I think in his notion of paradigm shift, and I'll just come back to that, there's two aspects or two sides to this as I see it. As you sort of said, everyone keeps on saying that this is complex. And so I think that paradigm shift, it's the phenomena that we're looking at. Is it complex? And I think there's more and more realization that it is. And I suppose part of that is, what do we mean by the fact that what we're looking at is complex? Has always been complex. Warren Weaver's paper about simple, complicated, and complex systems, and how we've approached organized and disorganized complexity. So in the past, we've kind of always seen that phenomena are complex, but it tends to be disorganized and slightly chaotic, and that raises the notion of noise. So everything's moving and random, but within there'll be a pattern of behavior. We've shifted away from that, and I think what we say by saying that phenomena are complex is to see like an ontological shift, that this is far more connected and ecological. By changing one thing will have an effect all the way through the system and what have you. So in one sense, to shift to understanding wellness, activity, and what have you as complex is suddenly to realize how all of this is interconnected. You know, your national setting, the sort of spaces that kids are exercising in, safety, blah, blah, blah. You know, so there's all those sorts of things. So that's one side of the equation. So the phenomena is complex, but then that raises the question is then how do we approach to studying that complexity, which I think is a slightly different issue. So can you, you know, what sort of lenses do we use to understand complex phenomena? And you've used things like agency and motivation and what have you to, you know, like a scientific approach to try and understand a complex phenomena. And so it's a really good question to say, are those sufficiently powerful enough tools to embrace complex phenomena? And it raises the question that the groups looked at before, you know, is there a theory, complexity theory that can understand complex phenomena, or are there theories of complexity that can be used? So that's one thing, and I think it's interesting within the study then to, as you've started to map there, that perhaps an understanding that the phenomena of wellness, fitness are complex is to alert us to the fact that it's broader than human agency, and that's where I kind of am interested in. My next point is that, as others have talked about, is that notion of self-organizing. So that people always self-organize within those constraints. Now, self-organization is not always conscious. So obviously, you know, we've studied self-organization in a whole variety of different ways. Reflexivity, that ability to reflexively understand, you know, the rules of the situation and you know, discipline your behavior accordingly. But I think it would be really interesting. You know, I think one of the problems I see in a lot of pedagogical research, especially research around teachers, is that we assume that a teacher has got this amazingly free agency, and if things aren't happening, it's just because the teacher doesn't know. So we got to educate the teacher better. Whereas I kind of think we need to attend more to the mechanisms that affect change. And you've mentioned them in here, and we've kind of highlighted some of them, like, you know, the NASPE standards would have some effect on teachers. You know, in fact, the kids, you know, everything changed in one sense because you were there. You know, you came into the system, you changed the system, and you saw the effect of that. And then as soon as you're removed from the system, it's interesting to know why the system either reverts back, or in the, you know, Texas case, they didn't always revert back. So I think that's interesting to sort of say, look, what can we do? How can we connect the system, and what sort of accountability measures and what have you can we put in place so that these things are not always conscious, but they're just, you know, affecting change. For instance, you know, say if at a school that no one was allowed to park within 200 meters of the school would mean that you'd have to park your car and walk at least every day 200 meters. That's not a conscious decision. That's just a mechanism that, say, the schools use to force additional physical activity. In a similar way, if you had rules around screen time for kids, or you build a really cool playground for kids, it might have the effect of increasing physical activity. So I don't always think it's a conscious thing. I think it's a matter of how those individuals are self-organizing within their environment, and that one of the things that is the effect is that they might be more active. and so I think that's kind of, you sort of said you did it one way, and then, there's a lot of stuff that's not being captured. And I think that might be some of the stuff that's not being captured, is that you can sort of see that, wow, these are some of it's not always about the kids, because you can see that the consciousness, and that's probably what we try and do as teachers, is always affect their rational side as opposed to looking at other aspects. My last thing, I suppose, is about perhaps going back to looking at the systems, the networks that are around those, that construct that social context. So what is it that enables or constrains physical activity, or fitness producing activity in those settings? And it, as I sort of said, it'd be interesting to map some of that, to say, wow, look, it's parental safety concerns, so they drop their kids off at school. I think one of the things that we noted whenever we come to the UK is, the amount of people that are walking, because, there's public transport's a lot more used in UK than it is in something like New Zealand. So the people are walking a lot more to catch public transport and everything. So, how those contextual differences and some of the constraints differing and varying, everything from food consumption, because I think within those systems, student subjectivity is positioned in different ways. So their own perception of whether, issues around diet and, what's cool, what's not cool, and those sorts of things are really important. So,
Alan, when I read a sort of 20, 30-year review of barriers and facilitators in Britain, but it drew from research around the world, and I've got the bug, but I just felt that the analysis had been drawn from a very linear perspective, because they were just saying, well, there's a green area here, and this is suburban, and there's television viewing and video viewing, but then there's controversial research to say that some video games encourage physical activity and some don't. But I get back to that revisit notion, because if we revisited the potential barriers from an emergent sort of unexpected way, it could be that it's not what affordance is there. It's the propensity for the children to be agentic and wish and want to make of it what it was. I mean, there's so many things that we didn't need to be told what to do, and I'm finding that children kind of are waiting to be told what to do now, and maybe by over teaching, they're losing what we're speaking of today. And I want for our pre-service physical educators, for our pre-service who are teachers, they have the wherewithal, they have the awareness, and it's very easy to give a wee bit of subject knowledge when someone gets it. It just makes it easier, and I'd like to encapsulate this in a way that's user friendly, but also it enables all of our stakeholders, my teachers in the classrooms, and also our pre-service teachers, to even look at the literature from a different perspective, to say, well, that's quite nice. It is unidimensional when they're looking at these barriers. It's a bit dualistic, it's a bit versus notion, but it's a start. So even if they can become better consumers of what's known through a complex approach, it might be that they can make more of it with the constraints that they have as they are in place at university or in the schools, or even the children.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with you in that sense, and I'd just probably conceptualize it in a slightly different way, because I think it's about how do we construct systems that enable either physical activity or the types of outcomes that we want. And so, we, as you're saying there, it's not a matter of just teaching people around for say complexity, but it's being conscious that we connect this person with this way of knowing, and this way of knowing enables them to engage with the world in a slightly different way. And that's what we've always done. And say in a course of study, we've sat down and we've kind of thought, how do we construct a system of knowledge in this particular way? And then I think more and more, and especially I know in the program that I'm involved in, we start with a very deliberate attempt to say it's going to be radical and different with a lot of complexity inspired ideas in it, whether we call that, ideas around critical, socially critical orientation or, new materialism, what have you. But we've constructed a context, a network of knowledge, professional knowledge in a particular way. And I think it's a matter of thinking in terms of how do we connect people to various systems that enable particular outcomes that we want, or at least from a complexity viewpoint, we know that when we connect the system in this way, it increases the probability of this as one of the outcomes. And as you said, I think one of the disappointing things is that our current society, produces youth and young people. What emerges from contemporary society is probably a very risk-averse, physically inactive, probably not physically competent young person. And so we need to, as I was saying, try and change some of those systems around to connect them into different ways of thinking, provide them with different activities so that they are the probability of producing a slightly different outcome is improved. Because I think, there are so many factors that come into play, and I always go back to, remembering my son when he was heading off to primary school, and the school had an idea of having a walking school bus. And I thought, that's a fantastic idea, that he's walking to school, so that's, feel confident that he'd walk with a group of other people. But then that idea has to also mesh with modern, occupational safety and health, and the school's responsibility to ensure that if it's organised something, it has to be safe. So next minute, there are a set of rules around that walking school bus. They started off absolutely ridiculous, with the kid at the front and the kid at the back having to wear an orange vest and hold a little flag. And the parent that was walking with them had to wear an orange vest, and all the kids had to stay in the middle. And I remember the first and only time we did it, driving off to work and seeing my son in the middle of this group looking at me with these eyes of hate saying, I ain't never doing this again. And he didn't, because 10 meters back further are other kids who are not part of the walking school bus program, who could walk to school without a friggin' helmet and what have you, flag and vest. So I think, but it is that modern society is networked in such a way that every good idea is kind of constrained within other sort of things. I think the school bus nowadays, when I see it, is a lot more relaxed, and they've advanced it on to get rid of the vests and the flags and what have you. But any good idea that you come up with seems to be, even trying to get kids to, plant trees and have, kids, be more active and more creative spaces. Suddenly, you can't have kids climbing trees. That's dangerous. Do we need safe landing spaces for them under the trees? And, do we paint lines on the trees so, this indicator they can't climb any higher than this? You can kind of think, it's gone nuts.
Thank you.
Well, I don't know about everybody else, but I have a meeting coming up here in about 15 minutes. So did we have anything else anybody wanted to add really quick?
Yeah, just on that point that Alan sort of made, I think the concept of time is a really, really important part of complexity, and leads to, I don't know if you've got that there, but that sort of recursive nature of the learning process. And I think schools compartmentalize time in a very specific way. And I think we then start to think, and assessment very often compartmentalizes time very quickly. So I think that the notion of time is one that needs to at least be acknowledged, because Alan's just point there about initially the school walking bus was crap, but you alluded to the fact that actually now it's probably quite good. So it is this issue of learning over time, and clearly logic in my head would be is that as we try to self-organize when we do something new for the first time, we tend to make mistakes. If we are time constrained, mistakes are a bad thing. If we're not time constrained, actually mistakes are a good thing, because they're a significant part of the learning process. Right, I think, I just go back to this idea of the constraints of the schooling system in every country in the world has, it does enable certain things to happen, but there are significant constraints that can go back to that point Alan made, that because it's all interconnected, time might just be the one that screws the whole thing up from time to time.
Yeah.
So anyway, that was a wee bit of a rant. I'll be quiet.
Awesome. Nicola, moving on to our next meeting, Nicola suggested that we possibly review an article for next week. What does everybody, or not next week, next month, what does everybody think?
Happy?
Very exciting.
Okay, so that's something I will work towards for next time. Thank
Why
you
is
so
Nicola
much.
not here? Where's Nicola?
She was here, but she's just popped out.
Yeah.
She's not been here the whole time I saw her. Not seen her picture.
I saw her picture for a bit.
Yeah, she was.
No, that was Endola, was it? It was a different
that was
name.
her.
Oh, that's some lovely stuff. Andy and Nicola. Oh, it's weird.
Enola, yes.
Oh, was it? No, it was Nicola.
Yeah, so I will work towards that for next time. I wanted to thank Allison so much. I know it was stressful, presenting for the first time, but it was really informative. It was a great presentation. And Mike, thank you so much for showing up. I know you have a wedding.
I have within the next 24 hours. Yeah.
Yes.
Wow.
Thank you so much for your input, everybody. My daughter gave me complexity lenses. And I've been writing everything down, so I'll try and make sense of it as we move forward. Thank you very much.
Pleasure. Nice to talk to you all again.
Yeah, nice to see everyone.
You all.
We will see you next month. Thanks, Lucas, for showing up. I hope you're here next time. That'd be great.
It was a pleasure.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah. Thanks, JC. Do a great
Thanks,
job.
everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you for your input. Thank you. Good evening or good morning,
Yeah.
Alan. Take
Yeah,
care.
go back to bed now.
Yeah, go back to bed. Cheers.